Most people are planning for a retirement they'll never actually get to enjoy. I know that sounds harsh. But look at the numbers. The World Health Organization tracks something called healthy life expectancy. Not how long you live, but how long you live well enough to do what you want. For Americans, that number sits at 66.1 years. If you retire at 65, you get 13 months. 13 months of genuinely good health, before the body starts sending invoices, before the knees go, before the fatigue that used to be temporary becomes permanent. A few years back, when I hit 58, I was staring at my own spreadsheet, thinking, push to 65, get the 401k to a round number, then call it. But the back pain was already showing up every morning. The schedule was grinding me down week by week. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I realized what I was actually doing. I was trading the last years when my body still worked for a bigger number on a screen. That's the trade-off nobody puts in the retirement calculator. You might hit $2 million at 65. But the math assumes your health waits for you. It doesn't. The real question isn't, do I have enough money? It's, do I have enough healthy years left to spend it? So why do 90% of us still grind through to that 65th birthday? It's not because we love our jobs. It's because of one specific fear sitting in the back of every pre-retiree's mind. Health insurance. The gap between leaving your employer's plan and Medicare. That gap used to be a genuine financial trap. Used to be. Because in 2026, that equation has changed in a way most people haven't heard about yet. Subscribe if you want to understand why the old rule no longer applies. Let's name what's actually happening here. There's a pattern I've watched play out more times than I can count. Someone in their early 60s, good savings, solid income, a 401k that's in decent shape, stays in a job they've mentally checked out of. Not because they need the paycheck for rent or food, but because the moment they hand in that resignation letter, they lose their health insurance. And they know what private coverage costs without an employer picking up the tab. That's not irrational. That's not weakness. That's a completely reasonable response to a system where a single serious diagnosis before age 65 can turn a retirement plan into a debt spiral. I've seen people describe it this way. I feel like I'm being held hostage by my own health card. That's exactly what it is. Here's the math that keeps people stuck. A couple in their early 60s shopping ACA marketplace plans without any subsidy assistance is looking at somewhere between $1,500 and $2,500 a month in premiums alone. That's $18,000 to $30,000 a year before a single doctor's visit, before a deductible, before prescriptions, just to have coverage for 5 years, from 60 to 65. That's potentially $150,000 in insurance costs just to bridge the gap to Medicare. And that number hits different when it comes directly out of the portfolio you spent 30 years building. Think about what that does to someone's psychology. There's a specific trap I've seen this create. A financial advisor might call it one more year syndrome. You tell yourself, one more year of employer coverage, one more year of contributions, one more year of certainty. Then another year passes. Then another. I knew a guy, engineer, 62 years old, $1,500,000 in savings. By any reasonable math, a 4% withdrawal rate gives him $60,000 a year to live on. He had rental income on top of that. He was done financially. But he wouldn't pull the trigger. Not because of the numbers. Because in the back of his head was this specific scenario. What if he retires at 62, loses employer coverage, and then gets a cancer diagnosis at 63? His $1,500,000 doesn't look so solid when you're staring down $400,000 in medical bills with no insurance backstop. So he stayed, grinding through a job he resented for coverage he might never need, to protect money he'd already earned. That fear is not irrational. It's responding accurately to a broken incentive structure. The American healthcare system has, for decades, created a situation where employment and health security are tied together in a way that traps people during the exact years they should have the most freedom. What it costs you isn't visible on a balance sheet. It shows up in the 5 years you spent in meetings instead of with your grandkids. It shows up in the weekend trips you didn't take because you were saving PTO. It shows up in the 66.1 number, that healthy life expectancy, ticking down while you wait. Loss aversion is protecting your savings from a catastrophic medical bill, but it's simultaneously spending something you can't replace. That fear makes complete sense. And the healthcare system in this country is genuinely expensive in a way that earns that fear. But here's where the logic breaks down. If you think waiting until 65 for Medicare is the safe answer, the free solution that removes the risk, you're walking into a different trap. Because Medicare isn't free, and it's not as open-ended as most people assume. That said, in 2026, there's a structural change in the law that most pre-retirees haven't found yet, and it changes the math on those 5 gap years completely. Let's clear something up first. Medicare is not free. I say that because most people planning for retirement have a vague sense that once they hit 65, healthcare stops being a financial problem. It doesn't. It just becomes a different kind of financial problem. One with more moving parts than most people realize until they're already enrolled. Here's how it actually breaks down. Medicare Part A covers hospital stays, and for most people, there's no monthly premium for that. But Part B, which covers doctor visits, outpatient care, lab work, runs around $185 a month per person in 2026. That's $370 a month for a couple, $4,440 a year just to walk in the door. Then there's Part D, which covers prescription drugs. Before 2026, this was the piece that could genuinely ruin a retirement plan. No hard ceiling on what you'd pay out of pocket. Specialty medications for chronic conditions, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, could run $5,000, $10,000, even more per year on top of your premium. The financial exposure was real, and it was unpredictable. And then most people add a Medigap supplement on top of all of this to cover the gaps Medicare leaves open. Another $150 to $300 a month per person. Add it up. A retired couple on Medicare in 2026 is still spending somewhere in the range of $800 to $1,200 a month on healthcare coverage. That's not nothing. Fidelity's most recent estimate puts lifetime healthcare costs for a couple retiring at 65 at around $350,000. When I first read that number, I sat with it for a while. $350,000 is not an abstraction. That's a rental property. That's a decade of travel. That's a significant portion of what most people have saved. I'll be honest, it rattled me. I spent a fair amount of time convinced that no matter how well I planned, healthcare was the variable I couldn't control. The one that could quietly drain everything. That feeling stuck with me until I actually went line by line through what the current law does and doesn't cover. Because here's what changed in 2026 that most people walking into a retirement planning meeting still don't know. The Inflation Reduction Act put a hard cap on Medicare Part D out-of-pocket costs. $2,000 per year. That's the ceiling. No matter what medications you're on, no matter what a specialty drug costs at retail, your personal exposure stops at $2,000 annually. What that does is convert the most unpredictable piece of Medicare, prescription drug costs, into a fixed line item. You can actually budget for it now. The catastrophic scenario, the one where a single diagnosis wipes out years of savings through drug costs alone, has been structurally removed from the equation. That's not a minor update. For someone managing a chronic condition or worried about what retirement might bring health-wise, this changes how you think about the math entirely. Medicare is still not free. The monthly premiums, the Medigap costs, the Part D base premium, those are real. But the open-ended downside risk that used to make healthcare in retirement feel like an unquantifiable threat, that's been capped. So here's what this means for the retirement timeline. From 65 onward, your healthcare exposure is now knowable. You can model it. You can plan around it. The catastrophic tail risk has been cut off, which means the only window that still carries genuine financial danger, the window where costs are unpredictable, where a bad diagnosis can cascade into financial ruin, is the 5 years between 60 and 64. That's it. That's the actual problem. And if you can solve that gap without paying $2,000 a month out of pocket for private coverage, the entire argument for waiting until 65 falls apart. That's exactly what the 2026 law makes possible. This is the part most people never get to, either because the conversation stopped at ACA is expensive, or because nobody sat down and explained how the subsidy system actually works in 2026. So let me walk through the mechanism. The Affordable Care Act has always offered premium tax credits, government subsidies that reduce your monthly insurance premium based on your income. For years, there was a hard cutoff. If your income crossed a certain threshold, you fell off what people called the subsidy cliff, and your credits dropped to zero overnight. $1 over the line and you were paying full price. That cliff is gone now. Under the current rules in 2026, there is no income ceiling for subsidy eligibility. Instead, the law caps what you pay for a benchmark silver plan at a maximum of 8.5% of your modified adjusted gross income, your MAGI. No matter what your assets look like, no matter what you have in the bank, what determines your subsidy is the income you actually report to the IRS in a given year. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. Because MAGI is not your net worth. It's not your savings balance. It's not what's sitting in your brokerage account. It's a specific calculation of reportable income, wages, taxable withdrawals, taxable investment gains, dividends. And if you structure your retirement withdrawals carefully, you can report a very low MAGI while still living well. This is the ACA bridge. Go back to the engineer from earlier. 62 years old, $1,500,000 saved, needed about $80,000 a year to cover his actual life. Mortgage, travel, groceries, the things that matter to him. Under the old math, he assumed ACA coverage would cost him $2,000 a month because his assets made him look wealthy. But assets don't determine your subsidy. Income does. Here's how he restructured his withdrawals. He pulls $30,000 from his Roth IRA, tax-free, and it doesn't show up in MAGI at all. He sells positions in his taxable brokerage account to generate $40,000 in proceeds, but his cost basis on those positions is $30,000. So only the $10,000 gain counts as MAGI. He collects $10,000 in qualified dividends. Total cash in hand, $80,000. Total MAGI reported to the IRS, $20,000. On paper, to the ACA marketplace, he looks like someone earning $20,000 a year. At $20,000, he falls at roughly 150% of the federal poverty level for a single person. At that income level, His silver plan premium gets reduced to $0 a month. Zero. He's not gaming the system. He's using exactly the structure the law was written to reward. That's $24,000 a year he no longer has to spend on premiums. 5 years of that is $120,000 back in his portfolio. And this is where something interesting happens. The same withdrawal structure that zeroes out his insurance bill also forces him to build a cash buffer, because he needs non-MAGI funds ready to draw from without triggering taxable income. Roth conversions done in earlier years, cash reserves, bonds, whatever low volatility cushion he's set up. That buffer, built specifically for the tax strategy, turns out to be the exact same thing financial planners recommend to protect against sequence of returns risk. The danger that a market crash in year one of retirement forces you to sell stocks at the worst possible time. The tax planning and the portfolio defense solve each other. You have a choice here. You can keep working so your employer buys your coverage, trading 5 years of your life for a benefit you could engineer on your own. Or you can design your withdrawal structure so the subsidy system does the work instead. I'm not a CPA, and before you move a single dollar around based on what you just heard, you need to sit down with a tax professional who can map this to your specific accounts and income sources. That's not a disclaimer I'm throwing in to cover myself. It's genuinely how this works. The details matter. The account types matter. The sequencing matters. But the mechanism itself is not a loophole. It's not aggressive tax avoidance. It's written plainly into the current tax code for 2026. And it's being used by a small fraction of the people who could benefit from it. Most pre-retirees in their early 60s have never heard this framed this way. They've heard ACA is expensive and stopped there. They haven't heard that the structure of their withdrawals determines the price they pay. Retirement isn't a math problem about how much you've saved. It's a math problem about how you move the money you already have. There's one objection that comes up every time I walk through the ACA bridge strategy, and it's a fair one. What happens if the market drops 30% the year after you retire? This is called sequence of returns risk. And it's the reason a lot of people who have done everything right, saved consistently, diversified, hit their number, still feel like early retirement is too dangerous to attempt. The math behind the fear is real. If you retire at 60 with $1,500,000 and the market drops 25% in year one, you're now working with $1,125,000 as your base. If you're pulling $80,000 a year out of a shrinking portfolio to cover living expenses, you're locking in losses at the worst possible time. The recovery math gets ugly fast. A portfolio that drops 25% needs to gain 33% just to get back to where it started, and that's before accounting for the withdrawals you've already taken. People who retire into a down market and keep pulling from equities can permanently impair a portfolio that should have lasted 30 years. That's the nightmare scenario, and it's not irrational to worry about it. But here's what I want you to notice about the ACA bridge structure specifically. To keep your MAGI low enough to qualify for subsidies, you need funding sources that don't generate taxable income in a given year. Roth IRA withdrawals, cash reserves, assets with low embedded gains. That means before you retire, you've had to build a buffer, 2 to 3 years of living expenses sitting in accounts that don't spike your reportable income when you draw them down. That buffer, built entirely for the purpose of tax management, is the same thing a conservative financial planner would tell you to build to protect against a bad sequence of returns in your first few years of retirement. The strategy designed to lower your insurance bill turns out to also be the strategy that keeps you from being forced to sell equities at the bottom of a crash. You're not choosing between smart tax planning and smart portfolio defense. You're doing both at the same time through the same structure. When the market drops 25% in year 2 of retirement, the person with no buffer has to sell stock to pay rent. The person running the ACA bridge draws from their cash reserve or their Roth, leaves the equity portfolio untouched, and waits. One path accelerates the damage. The other absorbs it. There's a way to think about retirement portfolios that I find useful. Some are built for fragility, fully invested, no cushion, dependent on steady returns to survive withdrawal pressure. Others are built for resilience, layered, with different buckets serving different functions, able to weather a bad year without forcing bad decisions. The ACA subsidy structure, almost accidentally, pushes you toward the resilient path, because the subsidy only works if you manage your income carefully. And managing your income carefully requires exactly the kind of layered portfolio architecture that holds up when markets don't cooperate. The tax planning and the crash protection aren't two separate problems. They're the same solution. Let's come back to where we started. 66.1 years. That's how long the average American lives in genuinely good health. If you retire at 65, you're not getting a retirement. You're getting a narrow window before the body starts making decisions for you. The fear that kept most people locked in until 65 was always health care. And that fear made sense because for a long time, the gap between employer coverage and Medicare was a real financial threat with no clean solution. But the threat has changed shape. In 2026, the Part D out-of-pocket cap closes the catastrophic risk on the Medicare side, and the ACA subsidy structure, no cliff, no income ceiling, just a percentage of what you actually report, gives you a legal, documented path to near zero premiums during the gap years, if you manage your withdrawals correctly. The system isn't broken in your favor by accident. It was written this way. Most people just never learn to read it. Waiting until 65 because you're afraid of healthcare costs is now, in most cases, a decision based on outdated information. The law changed. The math changed. The trap that held people in place has a door in it. You can always find ways to earn more money. You cannot find more mornings where your knees don't ache before you get out of bed. You cannot buy back the years when travel was easy, when your energy was reliable, when the people you wanted to share retirement with were still here. Don't let a misunderstanding of the tax code cost you 5 years of that. If this breakdown of the MAGI structure was useful, hit subscribe. Wes Investor will keep pulling apart the hidden rules of the American financial system. The ones that are already written into law, already available, and almost never explained in plain language. Drop a comment below if you're trying to work out what your own MAGI picture looks like in early retirement. I read them. See you in the next one.